Hey everyone, in this video I'll show you how to build your new drop bar Poseidon X from start to finish so you can start riding today. Now the bike is mostly assembled and set up out of the box, so you don't need to be an expert mechanic, and with a few basic tools you'll be riding in no time. You'll need a pair of wire cutters or scissors, a set of metric Allen wrenches ranging from 4 to 6 millimeters, a 15 millimeter spanner or pedal wrench, bike specific grease, a bike pump with a Presta valve head, and optionally a bike work stand and a torque wrench with a Newton meter scale. Okay, so first open the box and pull out the saddle, which is already attached to the seat post, and set it aside before pulling the rest of the bike out of the box. There will also be a smaller box which contains small parts and some documentation as well. Now the bike is really well packaged and protected, so grab a pair of cutters and be prepared to cut a lot of zip ties, being careful not to scratch anything in the process. Cut the zip ties holding the front wheel to the frame and remove the disc rotor protector, and you can set the front wheel aside. Now you might consider leaving the zip ties that hold the handlebars to the frame just for now, so they don't dangle and place unnecessary stress on the cables when you hang the bike in the work stand. Remove and discard the plastic plug in the seat post. Then remove the packaging from the seat and seat post and spread a thin layer of grease on the inside of the frame's seat tube. Slide the seat post into the frame and cinch it down using a 5 millimeter Allen wrench. No need to worry about final position or bolt torque just yet. Clamp the bike from the exposed seat post in a work stand if you have one. Continue removing packaging from the bike, again being extra careful not to scratch the frame or anything else when you cut the zip ties. Rotate the fork to the proper orientation with the stem facing forward and the brake caliper on the left-hand side of the bike if you were sitting on the bike in riding position. Remove the stem faceplate by removing the 4 4mm Allen bolts. Orient the handlebars such that the brake and shift cables are out front of and below the handlebars with no awkward kinks or bends. There's actually only one proper orientation for the handlebars, but it may take a couple of tries until you find it. Reinstall the stem faceplate and cinch the handlebars down. Try to put equal torque on each of the 4 bolts with an equal gap above and below the handlebar. Roughly center the handlebars using the crosshair markings, but don't stress too much as we'll do a final adjustment and torque check later. Next, open the small parts box and grab the front skewer. Remove the plastic cap on the hub, and if it's too tight you can use a pair of pliers. You should be able to see all the way through the axle with all the packaging removed. Then remove the cap and one of the 2 springs from the skewer and feed the skewer through the axle with the lever on the same side as the disc rotor. Reinstall the spring and nut on the opposite side of the skewer, noting the correct direction of the spring. You only need to screw the nut on a few turns as we'll set the proper tension in the next step. Slide the front wheel in the fork, making sure the disc rotor slides between the 2 brake pads, and begin tightening the skewer, but don't tighten it all the way down. Incrementally tighten the skewer, periodically checking the quick release lever by closing it and opening it. Continue to tighten until the quick release lever meets tension roughly when it's pointed straight outward. At this point, squeeze the lever up toward the fork leg to provide the proper amount of clamping force on the hub. Next, unpackage the pedals, which can be found in the small parts box. Note that the pedals are left-right specific and they can't be switched. The right side or the drive side will have normal threads, while the non-drive side will use a reverse thread. Lightly grease the pedal threads and hand tighten into the cranks, making sure not to cross-thread them. They should thread onto the cranks with little effort until you snug them up against the crank arms. Use a 15 millimeter pedal wrench or a thin spanner wrench or an adjustable wrench to tighten the pedals. The pedals should be very tight, but don't overdo it. 35 to 40 Newton meters is a typical torque spec, or roughly 30 pounds of force at a lever arm of 1 foot. A dedicated pedal wrench is nice because it's thin and can fit easily between the pedal and the crank, and they're usually pretty long, giving you plenty of leverage. But if you don't have one, an adjustable wrench will do fine. Just be careful not to scratch your crank arms in the process. So moving on to the brakes, there may be a little bit of setup required here. Pre-stretching the brake cables is a good idea and only requires that you squeeze the brakes as hard as you can a few times. This will prevent the brakes from coming loose after the first couple of rides. The calipers also have a single-sided pad adjustment, which allows you to bring the pads closer to or further from the disc rotors using a 5 millimeter Allen wrench. Now if you hear the brake pads rubbing when you spin the wheel, it's very helpful to shine a light behind the rotor, which will reveal where the brake rubbing is occurring. You can then make fine adjustments to one of the brake pads until the disc rub is gone. Now if you aren't able to use the pad adjustment to eliminate the disc rub, you may need to recenter the caliper about the rotor. You can do this by loosening the 2 mounting bolts and sliding the whole caliper until it's centered. So moving on to shifting, the bike should be pretty well adjusted out of the box, but you may need to make some basic adjustments to dial in the shifting. The Microshift Advent X 10-speed system is a budget option, but when dialed in, it performs really well. There are two levers on the side of the shifter. The higher lever will shift into a smaller rear cog, giving you higher top-end speed, but less ability to climb hills. The lower lever will shift you into a larger rear cog, giving you lower top-end speed, but a greater ability to climb steep hills. Run through the gears and make sure you can shift smoothly into every gear on the cassette. If it's hesitating to shift into a larger cog, twist the barrel adjuster counterclockwise as if to unscrew it by a quarter turn at a time until you can smoothly shift from smaller cogs into larger ones. If it's hesitating to shift from larger cogs into smaller cogs, you can turn the barrel adjuster clockwise as if to tighten it until you can shift from larger cogs into smaller ones. This process is called indexing the gears and may or may not need to be done out of the box. In the unlikely event that you can't smoothly shift up and down the cassette after indexing the gears, it might be an issue of derailleur hanger adjustment, B-screw adjustment, or high and low limit screw adjustment, all of which are easily adjusted by a qualified mechanic, but beyond the scope of this video. Now I should mention a nice feature about the Advent X derailleur, which is the integrated clutch. You'll notice that there's a 2-position switch on the side of the derailleur, which engages and disengages the built-in clutch. When the clutch is disengaged, the lower cage is free to move with little resistance. This generally yields slightly smoother shifting at the expense of chain stability. Now when the clutch is engaged, there's a lot more resistance in the lower cage, which helps with chain retention and significantly reduces what's known as chain slap, where the chain will bounce around against the frame during chunky off-road descents. It can potentially chip or ding your frame. Now, generally speaking, you can always leave the clutch engaged unless you plan to ride in absolutely smooth conditions with no off-road bits. Next, inflate your tires to your preferred pressure using a floor pump with a Presta-compatible head or a basic pump with a Presta valve adapter. Remove the valve cap and be sure to loosen the valve nut all the way. No need to worry, it can't come off, so loosen until it stops turning. Tire pressure is very personal and depends on the rider's weight, riding style, and the terrain. Now for these stock tires with inner tubes, I recommend a pressure somewhere between 35 and 45 psi for starters. Now you may be tempted to pump them up higher, but recent trends are all leaning towards lower pressures, improving comfort and grip at virtually no expense to rolling efficiency. When you're finished, be sure to close the valve and reinstall the cap. Now with the bike on the ground, we'll start making some final adjustments. Make sure the handlebars are straight with respect to the front wheel and tighten the stem bolts down, alternating bolts by half a turn or so until they're both equally tight. Now if you can't stand the idea of your handlebars being anything but perfectly straight, this video up here will help you get them perfectly aligned. You can then get the rotation of your handlebars dialed in, and you can adjust the position of your drifters via the 5mm Allen bolts buried under the rubber hoods. The single pinch bolt will allow you to rotate the shifters and move them vertically a few millimeters in either direction. You can then adjust the seat angle and fore-aft position by loosening the single 6mm bolt underneath the saddle. A good starting point would be a flat saddle about midway between the two endpoints. When you have your seat where you like it, be sure to torque the saddle bolt down tight. Adjust the saddle height by using the 5mm pinch bolt at the top of the seat tube. When sitting on the saddle, you should have a slight bend in the knee when your foot is at the bottom of the pedal stroke. Aim for about a 20 to 25 degree bend for starters. If the saddle's too low, you'll lose out on pedaling efficiency, and if it's too high, it can lead to knee pain or other physical pain. Now once you're happy with your bike's fit and feel, it's a really good practice to torque down all the bolts to the proper specification using a dedicated torque wrench. Stem pinch bolts, handlebar pinch bolts, and seat post clamp should all get about 5 Nm of torque, while the shifters should get between 6 and 8 Nm. Lastly, before you go out for your first ride, be sure to bed the brakes properly to ensure optimal braking performance. The bedding process serves to deposit a bit of the brake pad material onto the disc rotor itself, which is absolutely essential for strong braking performance. Find an open space and get up to about 15 or 20 miles an hour, then drag the front brake with moderate braking force until you reach walking speed, but don't come to a complete stop. Repeat this process 15 or 20 times and the brakes should start to bite stronger and stronger, but won't reach full strength for at least a few dozen miles. You can then repeat this whole process for the rear brake, which will complete the brake bedding process. And that is about it. Your new Drop Bar X is all set up and ready to roll. Now the bike will take a couple of rides to settle in, and it's a good idea to recheck the bolt torques after your first dozen hours or so on the bike. Now be sure to inflate your tires before each ride, and it's a good idea to periodically inspect the braking and shifting systems for signs of wear and misalignment. For now though, congrats on setting up your new bike and enjoy the ride.